So we are back together. This lecture is going to be on nominations, elections, and campaigns. And I know that on Friday in class, we started talking about political parties and the structure of them. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about parties, mostly because we focused on it in the political behavior unit. Most of you have a really good grasp on what Republicans and Democrats believe. So we're going to focus mostly on how the parties work and then how they work together to get their candidates elected into office. So that's where the primary focus of this unit will be. So let's talk a little bit about campaigns. When we're talking about the political context, what we're really talking about are the things that structurally build up what we know as politics in America. So there are some things when we're talking about campaigns that just have to exist, or at least do exist in our current day and age. The first is whether you are an incumbent or a challenger. The word incumbent was one of your vocab words, so you can definitely use this for your note card. Basically, if you are an incumbent, you have been already in office. So last presidential election, Barack Obama was the incumbent. He was the current president. He was holding the office already. It's much easier to win if you are an incumbent. You already have press. You already have people who, obviously support you. Again, you might have some people who don't, which can be a problem, but you're really working on maintaining the people who support you, which is a little bit easier to do than getting people to support you. And then you can focus on those who don't. Being a challenger is harder. The incumbent usually has more money than you. They usually have more press time than you. Their name is usually more visible than yours, mostly because they have a constituent, they have a citizen base that they've already worked with for however many years. So it's much harder to win as a challenger, which is why sometimes people that we don't necessarily like maintain and stay in office, mostly because they don't have a ton of candidates running against them. And sometimes, people who think about running for office get nervous because they know if someone's been in that position for 10 or 15 years, it's going to be extremely hard to win against that candidate. So which is also why campaigns get kind of so negative. I mean, you have to really especially when you're running against an incumbent, tell a story that's horrible about them or have some kind of scandal break. I mean, that's the thing that could get an incumbent out of office. Obviously, another thing when we're talking about campaigns is where you live, the kind of state or district that you live in. For example, in a place like New Hampshire, I mean, it's very politically oriented there. It's a highly Republican base, and so Republicans flourish in, one of the very few New England states. Most New England states tend to be Democratic with the exception of New Hampshire. When you're talking about something like a Pennsylvania or a Florida, that state fluctuates. There's a large base in Pennsylvania of Democrats in places like Philadelphia, Allentown a little bit, definitely Pittsburgh. And then there's a lot of rural areas that are more Republican-based, places, like Lancaster, places in central Pennsylvania. So depending on where you live, depends on how politically involved people are and also, the kinds of people that are going to come out and vote and the kinds of people that you need to pull on your side. So, each candidate, when they're running a campaign, they're going to pay special mind to the kinds of people that live in those districts and states. And obviously, the kinds of people that live in Florida and the issues that they are, worried about are going to be very different than the people who live in Rhode Island. And then, obviously, because of where people live, the kinds of people that are running in these campaigns, they have to appeal to specific, significant political issues within each of these states and districts. In other words, the candidate, whether they are an incumbent or whether they are a challenger, needs to look at each state, look at each district, and figure out what those political issues are within them. So, obviously, an industrialized city like a Pittsburgh is going to be have extremely different needs and wants from its citizens than a place like Lower Merion, where people are extremely wealthy. Most people are doctors, lawyers, business owners, bankers. It's one of the highest wealth income areas in Pennsylvania. So when Corbett and Allison Schwartz are running for governor this year, they're going to be paying special mind to each of these areas, right? So when they go give a speech in Pittsburgh, it's going to be extremely different than when they give it in Lower Merion. And the things that they talk about in Philly are going to be extremely different than the things they talk about in Lancaster. And they have to do that to be politically, to win. There's no way for them. They can't deliver the same message across the board. They have to tailor it and alter it to fit each individual state, district, and then, of course, the people that they're talking to within those districts. So we're not going to focus as much on, local kind of races. I know I just used Governor Corbett and Representative Schwartz as an example, but we're going to focus mostly on congressional and then obviously the presidential nominations. So the nomination, is just the idea that one of the two major political parties, so Republicans or Democrats, they endorse a candidate for office. So, if you affiliate as a Democrat or a Republican, you don't sign up, you don't pay dues, you just are one of them. You affiliate and you can flip-flop. And when your party nominates a candidate, it's basically saying, hey, most of us in this party agree this is the person for the job. And obviously that helps people who identify as one of those two major party members. Obviously, a ton of money, a ton of media attention, and then just momentum is required for any campaign, for any nomination. And because of that, candidates really try to use a variety of strategies, whether it's fundraising and getting more money so that they can eventually get more media attention, whether it's on commercials, writing a book, doing interviews, whatever, or if they need media attention to get the money so that they can have the signs and all of that made, whatever strategy the campaign manager would look for to kind of get their campaign going is also the thing that gives you momentum. So speaking of just kind of like what the road is, it's a long one. Running for any political office in America, it's pretty labor intensive. They're more physically demanding and emotionally demanding than they ever were. I would say probably since around, the Kennedy election in 1960, the TV really changed everything, and we talked a little bit about that in the last unit, but I think we didn't really highlight we highlighted what TV was able to do to help Kennedy win that debate, but we didn't necessarily talk about what TV was able to do for other candidates just in general. And what I think is so unique about television is that because it can capture the essence of you as a human, it's not just your voice, it's the way you look, it's how you smile, it's your appearance, it's, it really does do a good job of displaying someone's emotions. And because it's so accessible to all of us, we can flip on, any of the major news stations and see what see our candidate up there. They're really constantly on watch, and so you have to be censoring what you're saying. You have to think very carefully about how you're delivering a message, and because of that, it's quite demanding. And also because we don't live in a very small country. It's not like we live in Haiti, where you could travel through the country in a couple days. America, as you know, is huge. And so to hit all 50 states, think about the idea of going from Washington to Alaska. That's a trek. But, do you not ever see candidates, do you not ever see citizens in Alaska? No, you have to hit all 50 states at least once during your campaign. And that's why most candidates are announcing at the very least a year in advance. During the Barack Obama 2008 campaign, the Democratic candidates started announcing something like I think it was 15 months before the actual election. So that's a year and 3 months ahead of time. And why? Because they knew it would be obviously a really close race, just to see who would even get the Democratic seat. And second of all, I mean, you know, it's in order to do what is required to win the office of something like the presidency, you need time. You need as much time as you possibly can. With that said, know that our campaign system is incredibly long, and most industrialized countries in the world, places like France and Britain and Germany and Japan, their nomination and election season does not run nearly as long as ours. In fact, ours is 2 times as long as any of those places. So this is something, again, that's really uniquely American. It's the idea of democracy is having everybody informed and on the same page, and today it takes about a year for that to happen. So let's just kind of look data-wise at what this long road is like. Because, as you see, right, look at this, November 2002 all the way to July 2004, okay? In between that time, you're going to have lots of candidates announce that they're running and then drop out. So I'm looking on this list here. I'm trying to think. Dean, right in the middle, Howard Dean. So he ran from November 2002, or that's at least when he announced, and then he ends up dropping out on Super Tuesday because of the whole Dean Scream thing that happened after the Iowa caucuses. You probably know the name Al Sharpton. Hopefully you know the name John Kerry. He actually entered a little bit late. He entered around May of 2003, and obviously he's going to get the Democratic nomination. He's not going to win, but he will get the Democratic nomination. So, it is a long road for most people, and they don't typically, last. They typically drop out because it is so emotionally and physically straining, and if you really know that you don't have the chance to win, there's no point in keeping up at that pace. It's just, it drains you financially. There's just a lot of strains that running for public office puts on people, which is why, it's not for everyone. So let's talk a little bit about something called the primaries. This can be confusing. I'm going to show you a couple of videos that hopefully break it down a little bit better. But primaries tend to be confusing in general. Certainly, if you look at the election chapters in your textbook, they both do a really good job of giving infographics to explain it. I highly suggest you pop one of those open either after the lecture or maybe, tomorrow or the next day or something like that, just to keep refreshing your memory. We will definitely answer any questions you have in class on this, and I am certain that you will. So it is probably a really unique feature of our nomination process. And basically, a primary election, right? Primary means first. So in primary is also kind of first important. So it's the first most important election that takes place. It's preliminary. It happens first, and it's conducted within each political party. So there's a Democratic primary and there's a Republican primary. And people from each of those parties, so regular members like you and I, get together, essentially, and they select who they think ought to run for public office in the upcoming election. So subsequent next. So if you're breaking down that definition, the first election conducted within the political party, so either Democrats or Republicans, to select candidates who will run for public office in the next election. That's what a primary is. Now there's a lot of different types. There's something called a closed primary. And so let me backtrack here. When I told you when you turn 18 and you go to renew your license and you'll get the opportunity to register to vote at that point. When you register to vote, depending on what state you live in, it'll affect if you want to vote in primaries and how you are allowed to. So Clarence asked last week, well, what if you register initially as Democrat, but then later on in life you change to be a Republican? Do you have to switch it? And I said you don't have to, but if you what I said is if you wanted to vote in a primary, and you all kind of looked at me funny, and I said, well, we'll talk about it later. If you want to vote in a primary, then you would want to switch. Now, it's not really a lot of paperwork, but it's paperwork, and we all know that sometimes none of us feel like doing it. So this is a reason why some people sometimes don't vote in primaries, because maybe when they were 18, they did register as a Democrat, but now they're a Republican, and they're not allowed to vote in the primary, so they just wait till the general election. So with that said, there are very specific rules depending on the kind of primary. The first is called a closed primary. And basically, in a closed primary, depending on how you have registered to vote, depending on how you have affiliated yourself with the party, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, you can go to your primary and vote on that particular party's potential nominees. So let's say 2016 comes around, okay? If you want to vote, and if you lived in a place where there was a close primary, you would go, if you were a Democrat, and you're going to vote between, I don't know, I'm just going to make people up, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and John Edwards. Okay, you would get to select from whoever has decided within the Democratic Party that they're going to run for office, and you would select from those people. So that's how a closed primary works. An open primary means you don't need to declare any party affiliation, and you basically choose one party's primary ballot, and you can take it into a voting booth. So you do it privately. Closed primaries are probably a little bit more open. Literally, it's more of like a discussion. Open primaries are kind of like a real voting. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because let's say you're really politically minded and you are a Democrat. You could go into an open primary and say that you want to vote the Republican ticket, and you could pick the weakest Republican candidate, which would help your party, which would help the Democratic Party. Do people do this? Absolutely. Is this why not a lot of people have open primaries? Absolutely. It can get a little shady. Now, I mean, people do it. Most people probably don't. They do take this pretty seriously. But yeah, there is a sabotage element, if you will, in an open primary. There's something called a modified closed primary, and basically that means that people within the individual state party, so you have to be registered within your individual state party, they decide whether independents can vote in their primaries and for which office. So if you register as an independent, then you wouldn't be able to vote in a closed or open primary because they just focus on the two major parties. However, if you are registered as an independent in a modified closed primary state, they will let you come. The party themselves decide whether they want independents, yes or no. They might let independents in. If you are an independent, you could go and vote for your particular choice within whatever party you've opted to side with at that particular moment. And then there's a modified open primary, and they allow independent voters to vote in their party's primary, but at that point they have to make a declaration. So if you register as an independent, when you go into a modified open primary, you have to that day declare something. You have to say that you are a Democrat or you are a Republican. Now, you don't have to change your registration status, but in order to be accepted into their primary, you have to kind of basically side with the party that particular day. You don't have to do that in a modified closed primary. They just basically give you both options of whatever you want, and you kind of pick whatever side of the room you want to sit on, essentially. Here's what it looks like. So our next upcoming election would be the 2014 congressional race, and each state does it a little bit different. So you can look at this chart here, and you get to see kind of, March is obviously a slow month, but May and June are the biggest ones in August. So you'll see more primaries, and you'll hear about them happening in your summer months. And if any of you are 18, and you lived in one of those states, you would be able to go and vote. Ours is in May, so I don't think any of you in the room are 18. And then in September, there's only one in November, because obviously as we approach November, we're going to have an actual election. So most of this stuff is going to happen in the early summer months, so that you can, so that the candidates can again know kind of who's going to get the nomination, tailor their message, and really focus on beating their challengers, or if they're an incumbent, maintaining their office. The nomination for presidency works a little bit different than in congressional races. So it works a little bit different for the president than it does for members of the House and the Senate. Up until the 60s, really up until the Kennedy election, okay, delegates would basically, so delegates meaning citizens who represent the party, would choose their nominee at the national convention. That changed around 1972, and basically now national conventions are more of a celebration for candidates and a confirmation than they are of the selection process. Typically, we basically know who's going to be selected by the time the national convention comes around. It's very rare that you wouldn't. So, for example, like Mitt Romney in 2012. So again, he was the focal point of the convention. He gave a keynote address. Everyone who spoke about him. So he was really, he was the big shot at the convention. Because why? Because everyone within the Republican Party had basically chosen him as the candidate, and those who didn't, the people that he was initially running against had all dropped out at that point because they knew that he was the choice. I'm going to show you a clip that does a really good job of breaking down how primary and caucuses work in a presidential race, much better than I could. So pay attention.
Because the whole election year is important. Election years begin with primaries and caucuses. They're elections to decide which Democrat candidate will compete against which Republican candidate in the presidential election. As regards the Democrats, it's almost certain that President Barack Obama will run for a second term. But who will Obama's rival be? Well, that's decided in the primaries and caucuses. Here, several Republicans compete for nomination as the presidential candidate. The way the primaries and caucuses are organized and who's entitled to vote varies from state to state. An important fact is that in some states all voters, and in others only Republicans, are entitled to elect a Republican candidate for the presidency. The dates of the primaries and caucuses are also fixed individually by each federal state. One day, Super Tuesday, is special. On Super Tuesday this year, 10 states elect a Republican candidate. But these Republican contenders for nomination as the presidential candidate are not elected directly, because citizens only elect delegates, who in turn are bound to a particular candidate. Altogether, 2,286 delegates are elected. The winner of the primaries is the candidate who ultimately obtains more than half of the delegates' votes. Once all the states have elected their delegates, it's usually clear who the candidate for the presidency will be. But officially, the delegates only vote for their candidate at the party's national convention. If none of the candidates obtains more than half of all the delegates' votes, negotiations are held within the party. Then some candidates may withdraw, so the delegates have to vote again. If that's the case, the delegates are no longer bound to a particular candidate. They can vote for a different candidate, and carry on doing so until one candidate wins. So after the party's national convention, it's clear and official who the Republican candidate challenging Obama over the coming months will be. The election campaign can begin. And the winner is decided by the citizens of the USA on Election Day, the 6th of November 2012. On that day, all US citizens over 18 can cast their ballot. But here again, like in the primaries and caucuses, the presidential candidates are not voted for directly. Instead, US citizens vote for electors, who in turn are pledged to vote for one of the candidates. So if someone wants Obama to be president again, he votes for an elector who is also for Obama. The number of electors in each federal state depends on the state's population. So at the end of an election day, in every state, a certain number of electors are for a Democrat president and a certain number are for a Republican president. However, they're not simply assigned to the presidential candidates, because in almost all states, the winner takes it all principle applies. Let's assume a state has 10 electors. 6 of them are for Obama and 4 for the Republican candidate. Then Obama has won the election in that state and gets the votes of all 10 electors. The Republicans go away empty-handed. The winner of a state takes it all. This is the reason why the election campaign is harder fought in some states than in others. Because while Texas, for example, almost always elects a Republican majority, and California almost always a Democrat majority, there are other states where the result is not so certain. These are the so-called swing states. Florida, for example, is usually a swing state. Before every election, it's uncertain which candidate will win there. Altogether, there are 538 electors. The candidate who has more than half of all electors on his side has won the election. And there, the 25 electors from Florida can definitely be decisive. So after the electors have been elected, it's actually already clear who will be president. But officially, the president is elected later by the Electoral College. It's then that all the electors cast their votes in their state. On the 17th of December. However, these votes are counted at a still later date, namely on the 6th of January 2013, by the U.S. Congress. And finally, then and there, it's also officially announced who will be entitled to move into the White House for the next 4 years.
So I hope that helped. Here is a commercial, actually, by the Hillary Clinton campaign that advocated about the importance of primaries and caucuses.
Wouldn't you like to take a big bite of sizzling grade A beef, smothered in melted cheese, pickles, tomatoes, and mayonnaise? Exercising is hard. Dancing is hard. Singing is hard. Caucusing is easy.
Okay. You want to put Hillary in the White House? First, you have to caucus.
It's not only important.
Caucusing is easy.
Here's how you do it.
First off, just about anyone can caucus.
You don't have to be registered or even be a Democrat.
You can register at the caucus that night.
As long as you're at least my age, 18. Or will be by November of next year.
So now that we got that out of the way, just remember these few simple steps.
First, circle the calendar for January 3rd.
Locate your precinct's caucus location at hillaryclinton.com.
It's probably at a nearby school, community center, or a church basement.
Be sure to be there by 6:30. Doors close at 7 p.m. sharp.
Bring a friend, a family member, or a neighbor.
I'm bringing Elise.
How do you do?
Hi, welcome. Are you here for Hillary?
You'll be greeted by Hillary supporters when you arrive. They'll direct you to the Hillary corner. It'll be the one with the Hillary signs. Then stand there.
1, 2,
5, 8,
and be counted.
Or if you prefer,
16,
24.
62.
Sit there and be counted.
Then stick around. It usually takes about an hour.
We have 79 for Hillary Clinton.
The person in charge will tell you when it's over.
It's usually over early enough to get back to your favorite TV show.
Then go home.
Until everyone, I just made history.
history.
And voted for the next president of the United States.
Simple, huh? Unlike some other things.
Knitting is hard, but caucusing is easy. Being married is hard. Caucusing is easy.
Dating is hard. Caucusing is easy.
Playing bridge is hard.
So that was basically a campaign commercial to get people just to come out to the caucus. So again, why elections have to and campaigning has to start so early. Hillary's team spent money just putting out that message, which is pretty incredible. That's kind of rare. We don't see as much of that here as places like Iowa and New Hampshire, mostly because they're the first primaries and caucuses. We're in Pennsylvania, we do have a primary, but it's a little bit later. you probably will see more of that, though, I'm thinking in 2016. So you will just have to keep your eyes open and wait. Okay, so just to kind of recap a little bit of that. So yes, the president technically is not directly elected by us. We give a recommendation, what we call the popular vote. But different convention delegates selected by the populace, by the people in the United States, okay? We select delegates who basically go to the national convention. They also, and from the national convention, they select people, the electors for the Electoral College, who will vote for the president based on what the population wants. Because this is such a big deal, they have started front-loading the primaries and caucuses to the early months. And I'm going to show you a map in a second that kind of really does a good job of really portraying it. They do it for a couple of reasons. One is to gain media and candidate attention. Two is to figure out who these delegates will be. That's especially important because that's really how the president functions. So you need to make sure that you have delegates both for the convention, so then they can be selected among those at the for the Electoral College. But basically, you see more front loading of announcements, endorsements, and then primary and caucuses earlier in the year. So here's what the presidential primaries and caucuses are going to look for 2016. So as you see, the lighter blues and the grays are those that either haven't cast a date yet. If you're in gray, or the super light blues are the May and June. You don't see a ton of them. Most of them will be in March of 2016. Or January, there's 2 in January, Iowa, obviously, and New Hampshire. And then February are the other big dates. So that's really when you're seeing April too, but you're seeing most of it happening in the first 4 months of the new year. So, 2016 is going to be extremely busy. So let's talk a little bit about what the primary nomination process, what some of those consequences are, what it looks like really. Obviously, timing and luck affects who wins because of these. So Barack Obama, this no-name candidate, wins a primary, and this is one of the major things that gets him elected to the presidency. He hadn't won one, though, initially. Dean wins one, Howard Dean. Hillary wins one. So it took a little while for him to win one, but once he did, he was able to get momentum. He won a caucus, I believe it was March, and that's the thing that kind of gives him momentum. So timing and luck can affect who wins. If you look at something like the Dean Scream, okay, he wins the Iowa caucus, but then makes a bonehead move. I mean, most of us in the class kind of thought it wasn't that big of a deal, but obviously lots of Americans did. He delivers the announcement at the end of the Iowa caucus, does his little scream, and 3 months later is out of the race. Doesn't win anything after that. So obviously timing and luck is really important here, and also giving and delivering a message, right? How your campaign really works. Those first initial months can get people in and out of primaries quite quickly. Because of the primary, initial, setup, when you're an incumbent president, you really don't have to deal with it. So there were no Democratic primaries this year because we already knew who our candidate was. Or I'm sorry, not this year, 2012. Our candidate was Barack Obama. He was the incumbent president. If you are an incumbent for your party in Congress, if no one decides to run against you within your own party, then you don't have to deal with the primaries as well. So let's say you are, I don't know, let's say Bob Casey. He's a Pennsylvania state senator. If no one decides to run against Bob Casey within his party, he's a Democrat, then, he's cool. He doesn't have to worry about going through a primary. He just has to focus on his Republican candidate. Obviously, being an incumbent and not having to deal with the primaries saves you money, saves you some time. You can let the other opposition party fight it out for a while you kind of sit back and get really good press because you're not being nasty at that point. You don't really need to be. You're letting them kind of duke it out. And it's a little bit easier for you. Obviously, candidates who the majority rules in this case. The people within the party who like a particular candidate, that's usually the person who wins. So, I mean, sometimes because of the Electoral College, people think one vote doesn't really matter. That is absolutely not true. It 100% matters. I mean, the electors within the college do look at all of that data, do look at what the population wants. But more importantly, we're the people who select these nominees. I mean, that is something that we're directly doing. And then obviously candidates win nominations on their own. So if you think back to the article we started reading in class on Friday about, from the Washington Post, have political parties lost their purpose? I mean, yes, did they get help from interest groups? Absolutely. But candidates are running on their own. There's all different kinds of Democrats, there's all different kinds of Republicans, and they're running on their own name, they're running on their own record, they're running on their own merits, the things that they've earned and done in life, and then they're running on certain platforms within their party, but, some Republicans look a lot like Democrats these days and vice versa. There's going to be Democrats who are, against abortion, there's going to be Republicans who are pro-choice, so there's this mixture of how different people are, and so it's up to the candidates really to get the support from the members of their party. It's not like the Democratic Party is, completely funding every candidate. They have to work and fight to be the Democratic national candidate. So after primaries and caucuses, that's when the general election is held, and the general election is held every even-numbered year. There's a difference between the congressional and senatorial general election versus a presidential general election. So I'm going to break that down for you. So basically, every 2 years, anybody in the House of Representatives runs. So if you are an incumbent in the House of Representatives, you are constantly campaigning because you can't just sit back for 2 years and not worry about campaigning because you have every 2 years an election. So being a member of the House is a little bit harder in some respects than the Senate because of those 2-year terms. It's good because you might be an incumbent for a long time, right? You can say you've served 10 terms in the House. But still, it's kind of a rat race in the respect that you are really constantly pushing and having to make sure that you do this really good balance of doing what you say you're going to do in Washington and not really wasting any time because you only have 2 years to make your record known to the people who are electing you, and then also not just worry about what you're doing in Washington, but really what you're doing to help the people within the district, the state that you represent. So the members of the House are watched a little bit closer than other, political offices because, they might be in and out. And there's also lots of changes within the House all the time. You always have people kind of coming in and out. So just something to keep in mind. 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are voted on each election year. So senators serve 6-year terms, so because they rotate, because of the 6-year terms, there will be like 1/3 of them will get elected in 2014, and then another third in 2016, and then another third in 2018. It's staggered. So because they serve 6-year terms, they have a little bit more leeway in the sense where they have more time to do things than normal, and that's great for them. They really have a chance to kind of I don't want to say relax, but get acclimated to the Senate. They have more time to do what they said they were going to fulfill their campaign goals, but that also means because they have more time, they absolutely have to do it. Members of the House often might say something like, if you reelect me, I promise I'm going to get this done. I need more time for this. Senators, it's kind of like, well, what have you been doing for the last 6 years? So there's a balance between both of those, right? There's good and bads. But yes, senators, are always constantly running, essentially, as well. There's always going to be state and local offices running, your local mayor elections that will take place, your city council and school board elections that will take place in something like our city. If you live in like a smaller town, like a Lower Merion, or where I live in Springfield Township, there'll be a town council, there'll be a town manager. So there's going to be lots of races for that as well in a general election. And then, of course, every 4 years, you're going to vote for the president, and that will take place in 2016. The general election years where there's a presidency being voted on, those typically are higher voter turnout years than when it's just, members of the House, members of the Senate, and your local state and offices. So the years that there's a presidency in contention for, there's going to be more outreach. Let's talk just a second about the Electoral College. Basically, there's 538 electors within the Electoral College. They count 535 for 100 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, 435 members of the House, and then 3 representatives for the District of Columbia. You need 270, which is more than 50% of 538 votes to win. If a no candidate receives a majority, then basically it's up to the House of Representatives to elect the president, which has only happened twice in history. And then basically every year, the amount of electors within each state changes because it's based on population. This really goes back to the whole Constitutional Convention, Virginia, New Jersey plan debate. I mean, essentially this was another reason why these people were fighting so hard to have 2 houses. And why James Madison wanted it to be based on population. So the electoral votes work based on population in the United States, based on how big a state is. And I'm going to show you a map in a second here. And obviously how they determine the population is a result of the census, which is why gathering census data for your state is so important. If people don't return it, you could lose electors. So here's what it looks like here's what it looked like rather for 2012. We can't predict what the 2016 Electoral College will look like just yet, but we will be able to. So you can see across the board, right, most of the bigger states, your California, 55, they have the most, biggest population state in the country. Texas is, not far behind with their 38. And then if you look at your swing states, Pennsylvania 20, Florida 29. What am I looking at here? Obviously, you have bigger ones like New York. They're not really swing though because they almost always go Democratic. They're 29 as well. So you see some of your North and South Carolinas over there. Even your Virginia, that's obviously Georgia's another one that tends to go Republican, but could in some years swing the other way. Arizona is a big one with 11. Illinois with 20. That's what, it was good for Barack to win Illinois just because it was his home state, obviously, but or that was the state that he was coming, as a senator, but again, big chunk of votes there. Whereas where I'm from, 2 votes is not really going to matter. Not to be mean, I love where I'm from and everything, but you don't see a ton of presidential candidates coming to Rhode Island. They might make 1 or so appearance. Why? Because you're not getting a lot of electoral votes. Same reason why they're not going to places like North Dakota and South Dakota. 3 votes, it's not worth it. You might make a 1 or 2 appearance there, but in general, you're going to focus on the double-digit, larger numbers that you can get to. So you're going to focus mostly on this area, down through here. Okay, you're going to focus on all these kind of big border states right here. You're going to hit some points up here, and then, a little bit of the middle of the country right here. You're not going to make too many trips to Hawaii or Alaska for obvious reasons. To kind of combat what we talked about with the popular and electoral vote, you can see that most of the time the electoral vote really closely aligns to what the popular vote wants. Again, there's only been two times. One was in 2000 with the Bush-Gore election. The other was in 1888. But it's obviously not a guaranteed result, but typically the Electoral College votes with what the general population wants. So I'm going to kind of show you what a ballot looks like in a second. So basically, let's talk a little bit about how the popular and electoral vote works more in depth. So each candidate is listed on a ballot, and so are anybody for this, Senate and the Congress, as well as your state and local offices. Now, there's a couple different types of voting that can take place. The first is called a straight ticket vote, and basically in a straight ticket vote, the single party candidate, okay, and all offices are voted on. So you could go into your ballot box and you could hit Democrat, and any Democrat that's listed for any office, that will be how you vote. You could do what I typically do, which is split ticket. And that's where you basically vote for different candidates from different parties for different offices. So you might vote for a Republican president, but you might vote for Democratic senators. You might vote for a Republican town councilman, but you might vote for all Democratic members on your school board. You might vote for somebody in the Green Party. You can kind of pick and choose. And this is more voting. So straight ticket voting is people who are really party-centered. They vote based on the party. Split ticket voting is people who are more candidate-centered. They focus more on who the candidate is, the kind of person the candidate is, what the person said they were going to do. Straight ticket voters vote just because, of their party affiliation. And split ticket voting often results in a divided government, which is what we're seeing in, the more modern generations. That's what we have right now. Split ticket voting is the kind of thing that gives you a Republican House of Representatives and a Democratic Senate with a Democratic president. All right, it's split all the way around. Here's what it looks like when you go in. So this is when you used to have to actually fill them in. You don't anymore. It's a button. But basically, if you, hit this, Democratic Party, Republican Party, Libertarian Party, if you hit that button, you're done. It's takes literally 10 seconds. If you opt not to use this, then you and you go through and you have to select individual candidates. So, we're going to end here. I know this was a little bit longer, but we haven't been together for a while, and when you come in on Tuesday, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at what's going to be taking place in room 410. So I will see you all then. Come prepared with questions. Make sure you fill out the Google questionnaire that goes with the lecture. And most importantly, make sure that you are starting your index cards. There are a ton of terms, and if you haven't started yet, you better now. Peace out, guys.